I was sitting in my car, in a grocery store parking lot in Chicago, at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. My phone buzzed. It was an email I'd been obsessively checking for 2 weeks. I opened the attachment, scanned the first line, and the entire world just tilted. 0% probability of paternity. It was right there, stark black and white on my screen. 0. Nothing. I thought that test, that single piece of paper, would finally shut down an argument, maybe force Sarah to admit the truth about her affairs, perhaps prove I wasn't just some paranoid, controlling ex-husband. I had no idea it would completely blow my entire life apart. To understand how I ended up in that moment, with my world shattering around me, you have to go back. For 9 long years, I'd been wiring money every single month like clockwork. I showed up to birthday parties, even when Sarah made it clear I wasn't welcome. I picked Leo up from school when she had other priorities. And I never, not once, complained about the system that left me eating ramen 4 nights a week while she lived comfortably in a house I helped fund. Look, I wasn't trying to be father of the year. I'll admit that. But I was there. I was consistent. And I made sure Leo never, ever felt like a burden. Sarah, my ex-wife, made sure everyone knew I was the bad guy in our divorce. The man who gave up on our marriage. The man who abandoned his family. But what she conveniently forgot to mention were the 3 affairs I discovered during our marriage. Or the financial chaos she created behind my back. Or the way she'd disappear for entire weekends and come back smelling faintly of someone else's cologne. I didn't fight her in court back then because I genuinely believed Leo needed stability. I didn't argue when she got primary custody because I felt a kid needed his mom. And I didn't push back when the judge set child support at a number that basically drained my bank account every month. I just paid. I kept my head down, and I tried to be the dad Leo deserved, even though his mother made it abundantly clear I'd never be enough. Then, last month, Sarah's lawyer sent me a letter. It wasn't just a request for an adjustment, it was a demand for a 30% increase in child support. Their reasoning? Inflation, rising costs, and the fact that my salary had actually grown since the divorce. I'm a financial manager. I work long hours, I've been promoted twice in the last 5 years, and yeah, I make more money now than I did when Leo was a baby. But that doesn't mean I'm swimming in cash. I still live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I still drive a car with 160,000 miles on it. I still budget every single dollar because half my paycheck disappears on the 1st of every month. Sarah, on the other hand, hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. She picks up part-time gigs when she needs quick cash, sure, but she's constantly posting on social media about spa days and weekend getaways. Every time I picked up Leo, he was wearing the same worn-out sneakers while she was sporting a new designer handbag. The money I was sending just didn't seem to be going where it was supposed to. And when her lawyer started throwing around phrases about financial responsibility and the child's needs, something inside me just snapped. I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I just asked for an audit. A simple breakdown of where the money was going. Receipts for Leo's expenses. Proof that this 30% increase was actually necessary. And you would have thought I'd asked her to commit a crime. Sarah blew up my phone with texts calling me controlling, accusing me of trying to punish her, saying I was weaponizing money to hurt our son. And when I didn't back down, she started posting vague messages on social media about deadbeat dads and men who exploited the court system. My phone lit up with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, mutual friends who suddenly had strong opinions about my parenting, coworkers who saw her posts and asked if everything was okay at home. I realized she was carefully building a narrative where I was the villain, and she was the helpless victim. I wanted to scream. I wanted to post my own side of the story, but I didn't. I knew it would only make things worse. So, I stayed quiet, letting her control the conversation, while I quietly figured out my next move. When someone gets that defensive over a simple request for transparency, what are they really protecting? We had a meeting, just the 2 of us, in a coffee shop near her apartment. I brought a folder. 9 years of payment records. Every bank statement. Every receipt. Every single piece of proof that I'd never been late, never been negligent, never been anything but reliable. I slid the folder across the table and told her, "I'm not trying to hurt you, Sarah. I just want transparency." She looked at me like I'd spit in her face. She didn't open the folder. She didn't even glance at it. She just stared at me with this cold, hard expression and said, "You've always been like this, Michael. Always needing to be right, always needing to control everything." I felt my hands shake under the table. I wasn't angry yet. I was just exhausted. Tired of being painted as the bad guy. Tired of paying for a life I wasn't truly part of. Tired of pretending that everything she did during our marriage didn't matter anymore. And that's when I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for almost a decade. The question that had been lurking in the back of my mind since the day I found out about her first affair. "After everything you did during our marriage, after all the lies. I think I deserve to know the truth," I said. She went completely still. "I need a DNA test." The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed like a bomb. For a second, Sarah just stared at me, like I'd spoken in a different language. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh, but this sharp, bitter sound. She asked if I was seriously going to punish our son because I couldn't let go of the past. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I just wanted to know. She stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. "You monster," she yelled, loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. Then she walked out, leaving me sitting there with my folder of useless receipts and a question I couldn't take back. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. When she finally responded, it was through her lawyer, a formal letter agreeing to the DNA test, under the condition that I continued paying child support during the process and covered all associated costs. I agreed. Because I didn't have a choice. And because a part of me, the part that had been there for every scraped knee and every bedtime story, believed the test would come back positive, and this whole nightmare would be over. I scheduled the test at a clinic downtown. Sarah brought Leo in without saying a word to me. I watched my son swab the inside of his cheek while his mother stood in the corner with her arms crossed, glaring at me like I was destroying his life. Leo didn't understand what was happening. He just knew his dad was being weird. And when the nurse handed me my own swab, I felt like the worst person in the world. The results took 2 weeks. 2 weeks where I couldn't sleep. Couldn't focus at work, couldn't do anything except imagine the different ways this could go. I told myself it didn't matter what the test said, that I'd still be Leo's dad, that biology wasn't everything. But deep down, I knew that if the test came back negative, everything would change. I kept checking my email obsessively, refreshing the page every 10 minutes. And then, that Saturday night, sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, I opened the attachment. 0% probability of paternity. I stared at those words on my phone screen until they stopped making sense. 0% probability of paternity. I kept rereading them, like maybe I'd missed something, like there was fine print that would explain how 9 years of my life had been built on a lie. I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, watching people walk in and out of the grocery store with their carts full of normal Saturday night things. I couldn't move. Moving meant accepting what I'd just learned. The weird part is, I didn't feel angry at first. I didn't want to scream or punch something or call Sarah and lose my mind. I just felt stupid. Like the biggest fool who ever lived. Like everyone had known except me, and they'd all been laughing behind my back for almost a decade. I thought about every birthday party where I'd shown up with gifts. Every school pickup where I'd rearranged my work schedule. Every night I'd gone to bed exhausted because I'd spent my weekend being a dad. And none of it had been real. Or at least, not in the way I thought it was. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days, because I didn't know how to say it out loud. I went to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, and pretended everything was fine, while my brain ran through every memory I had of Leo as a baby, looking for signs I'd missed. I started seeing things that weren't there. Or maybe they'd always been there, and I just ignored them. Like how Leo had her eyes and her laugh, but nothing that looked like me. Or how, during the pregnancy, Sarah had been strange about doctor's appointments, always going alone, always brushing off my questions. I called my brother on Wednesday night and told him everything. He went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. He asked what I was planning to do, and I realized I had no idea. Sarah didn't reach out after the test. Not a single text, not a call, nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know. She'd known. Maybe not for certain, but she'd known it was possible. And she'd spent 9 years betting I'd never ask. That I'd just keep paying, keep playing dad, and never question the story she'd sold me. On Friday, I got an email from her lawyer, not about the test results, but about the child support increase. Like nothing had changed. Like the DNA test was just a minor inconvenience we could all move past. The email talked about setting aside our differences for Leo's sake and hoping I'd do the right thing and continue supporting my son. I almost threw my laptop across the room. I forwarded the email to a family lawyer I'd found online, a woman named Elena, who had excellent reviews and a reputation for not backing down. I scheduled a consultation for Monday morning. Elena looked at the DNA results for maybe 10 seconds before she looked up at me and laid out my options. I could petition to terminate child support immediately. I could sue for repayment of what I'd already paid. I could fight for custody if I wanted to maintain a relationship with Leo, despite the biology. Or I could walk away completely. I told her I didn't want to hurt Leo. That he didn't ask for any of this. She nodded like she'd heard it 1,000 times before. She explained that I needed to think about myself, too, because Sarah wasn't going to stop demanding money just because the truth was out. I signed the paperwork that day, a petition to terminate child support and a request for an emergency hearing. Elena said she'd file everything by end of business. That's when Sarah started her campaign. And I mean campaign, because what she did next was calculated and vicious. Designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. She posted on every social media platform she had. Long, emotional posts about how I was abandoning a child I'd raised for 9 years. How I was using DNA as an excuse to escape my responsibilities. How I was traumatizing Leo by rejecting him over something he couldn't control. She didn't mention the affairs. She didn't mention the lies. She just painted herself as a struggling single mom and me as a monster who decided biology mattered more than love. My phone exploded with messages. People I barely knew telling me I was disgusting. Coworkers asking if the rumors were true. Even my own mother called to ask what I was thinking. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to post the DNA results, the affair timeline, every piece of evidence that showed who Sarah really was. But Elena told me not to. Anything I said publicly could be used against me in court. So, I just watched my reputation burn while Sarah played the victim. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. And in that time, Sarah did something I didn't expect. She named the biological father. A guy named Mark, who'd worked with her at an insurance company back when Leo was conceived. She did it through her lawyer, in a formal statement that basically threw him under the bus while still trying to keep my wallet open. I'd never heard of Mark. Didn't know what he looked like or if he even knew Leo existed. But apparently Sarah had kept in touch with him over the years, and now she was dragging him into this mess, too. Elena called me and told me things just got more complicated, because now there were 3 parties involved. Me, trying to get out. Sarah, trying to keep the money flowing. And Mark, who might not even know he had a kid. If you were Mark, and you just found out you potentially had a 9-year-old son you never knew about, what would you do? I looked Mark up on social media, found his profile in about 5 minutes, and spent an hour scrolling through photos of his life. He was married, had 2 kids of his own, worked as a sales manager, looked happy in that basic suburban dad way. I wondered if he had any idea what was coming. Part of me wanted to message him, warn him, tell him that Sarah was about to blow up his life the same way she'd blown up mine. But I didn't, because Elena had made it clear I shouldn't contact anyone involved in the case. 2 days later, Mark's lawyer filed a motion demanding his own DNA test. Which meant he either didn't know or didn't believe Sarah. Suddenly, there were 2 legal battles happening at once. Me trying to get out, and Mark trying to figure out if he was in. The worst part wasn't the court dates, or the lawyers, or even the money I was spending to untangle this nightmare. The worst part was Leo. Sarah had told him some version of the story. I don't know what exactly, but when I showed up for my next scheduled visitation, he looked at me differently. Like I was a stranger. Like I'd done something wrong. He barely talked. During the whole visit. Just sat on my couch playing games on his tablet. When I tried to explain that I still cared about him, that none of this was his fault, he just shrugged and said his mom told him I didn't want to be his dad anymore. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to tell a 9-year-old that his mom had lied about everything. So, I just told him that wasn't true and left it at that. But I could see he didn't believe me. Elena filed the lawsuit the following week. Not just against Sarah, but a formal petition for fraud and repayment of child support. She warned me it was going to get ugly. She said Sarah would fight back, would use every trick in the book, would try to make me look like the villain. And she was right. 2 days after the filing, Sarah's lawyer submitted evidence that I'd allegedly known about her affair with Mark during the marriage and had accepted Leo as mine anyway. The evidence was a series of text messages between me and Sarah from years ago. Messages where I'd said things about wanting us to work and believing Leo needed both of us. They were twisting my words to make it sound like I'd known all along and had waived my right to contest paternity. I read through those old messages and felt sick, because they were real. I had said those things. But not because I knew Leo wasn't mine. I'd said them because I was desperately trying to save a marriage that was already dead. The hearing was scheduled for early November. 2 separate cases now running parallel, mine against Sarah, and the state's case to establish Mark as the legal father. Elena said, depending on how things went, this could drag on for months, or even years. I asked her what my chances were, and she gave me this look that told me she'd seen cases like mine go both ways. She explained that it really depended on the judge. Some saw this as clear fraud, while others saw it as a man trying to escape responsibility. We needed to be prepared for anything. I went home that night and sat in my apartment staring at the wall, thinking about how I'd spent 9 years building a life that wasn't real, and how the only way forward was to tear it all down. Sarah called me directly for the first time in weeks, using a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, she asked if I was really going to destroy everything. I told her she'd already done that. She hung up. The first hearing happened on a cold morning in early November. One of those days where the sky is gray and everything feels heavy. I sat in that courtroom watching Sarah's lawyer paint me as a man who'd raised a child for 9 years and was now abandoning him over a piece of paper. They had photos of me and Leo at birthday parties. Screenshots of text messages where I'd called him my son. Even a Father's Day card he'd made me in 2nd grade. They displayed it all like evidence of some kind of contract I'd signed in blood. Sarah sat at her table looking devastated, dabbing her eyes with tissues, playing the part of the heartbroken mother protecting her child from a monster. I wanted to stand up and scream that she'd lied about everything, but Elena squeezed my arm and whispered that I needed to stay calm. Judge Evans, an older woman who looked like she'd seen every trick in the book, listened to both sides without much expression. When Sarah's lawyer finished his performance about the importance of emotional bonds over biology, Judge Evans asked one simple question that cut through all the noise. She asked if Sarah had known or suspected during the marriage that the child might not be mine. Sarah's lawyer stumbled over his words, trying to avoid a direct answer, talking about the complexities of relationships and the fog of memory. I watched Judge Evans's expression shift from neutral to skeptical in about 5 seconds. Elena stood up and presented the DNA results. The timeline of Sarah's affair with Mark. The fact that Sarah had never once suggested a paternity test herself, despite knowing about the affair, despite having every opportunity to come clean during the divorce proceedings 9 years ago. She brought up the child support modification request that had triggered this whole mess, pointed out that Sarah had demanded more money while simultaneously hiding information that would have made me not legally responsible for any payments at all. She argued that this was textbook fraud. Sarah's lawyer tried to redirect, claimed that I'd implicitly accepted paternity by being involved in Leo's life. But Elena was ready with case law, showing that fraud undermines everything. You can't enforce a contract or obligation that was based on a lie. Judge Evans called for a recess and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks. As I walked out of that courtroom, Sarah tried to approach me in the hallway, but her lawyer pulled her back. I just kept walking. I didn't hear anything for 10 days. During that time, I lived in this weird limbo, not knowing if I was still Leo's father in the eyes of the law, or if I was about to be released from a 9-year sentence I'd never deserved. I kept going to work, kept paying my bills, kept checking my email obsessively. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, Elena called and told me to sit down. Judge Evans had ruled in my favor. She terminated my child support obligation effective in 30 days, pending any appeals. And she ordered Sarah to provide full financial documentation for a separate hearing about repayment of past support. Elena said it was a significant win, that judges rarely went this far in paternity fraud cases, but that the fight wasn't over because Sarah could appeal, and because the repayment case was going to be brutal. I asked what happened with Mark, and Elena said his DNA test had come back positive. He was Leo's biological father, and the state was now pursuing him for future child support while my case against Sarah for repayment moved forward separately. That's when Sarah made her biggest mistake. The kind of mistake that turns a civil case into a criminal investigation. About a month after the ruling, I got a notification from my bank about unusual activity on an old joint account I'd set up during our marriage for emergencies. One that was supposed to have been closed during the divorce, but had somehow slipped through the cracks. Someone had charged $8,000 to it over the course of 3 days. When I called the bank, they told me the charges were for cash advances and transfers. I immediately thought of Sarah. I pulled up the account history online and saw that she'd been using it sporadically for months, small charges here and there that I'd never noticed. But now she'd gone big. Probably panicking about losing child support and thinking she could grab whatever she could before everything crashed down. I reported it to the bank, filed a fraud claim, and called Elena, who told me this was potentially identity theft and that I should file a police report immediately. I went down to the station and gave them everything, the account statements, the timeline, proof that I'd never authorized the charges. The officer taking my report looked at me with this mix of pity and disbelief. Over the next month, the bank's fraud department confirmed that the signatures on the cash advance slips didn't match mine, that the IP address for the online transfers traced back to Sarah's apartment, and that they were referring the case for prosecution. Elena called me and said Sarah had just made my repayment case 10 times easier, because now it wasn't just about child support fraud. It was about financial fraud, forgery, and theft. The final hearing was scheduled for mid-December, and by that point, Sarah's world was falling apart in real time. She'd lost her part-time job after the fraud investigation became public. Mark's wife had filed for divorce after finding out about Leo. And the legal system was now pursuing Mark for child support while simultaneously investigating Sarah for multiple counts of fraud. I showed up to court with Elena. Sarah showed up with a public defender because her original lawyer had dropped her. She looked completely different from the confident woman who demanded more money just 7 months earlier. Judge Evans reviewed everything: the original paternity fraud, the account theft, the forged documents, and the pattern of deception that had gone on for nearly a decade. When Sarah's public defender tried to argue that she'd been acting out of desperation as a single mother, Judge Evans cut him off and said, "Desperation doesn't justify fraud." the ruling came down hard. Sarah was ordered to repay $60,000 in child support I'd paid over 9 years. She was placed on probation for the financial fraud. And she lost primary custody of Leo, pending a full evaluation. The judge said that Leo would be placed temporarily with Sarah's parents under court supervision while custody arrangements between Sarah and Mark were being determined, and that I would have the option to pursue visitation if I wanted to maintain a relationship with the child I'd raised. I sat there listening to all of this and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No victory. Just this overwhelming exhaustion that comes from watching something you built get demolished piece by piece. Sarah looked at me as they read the custody decision, and her face was blank, like she'd finally run out of performances. I wondered if she'd ever actually cared about Leo, or if he'd just been a paycheck to her all along. I walked out of that courthouse in mid-December with the winter air biting at my face. Elena told me the repayment would probably take years, that Sarah would likely declare bankruptcy, that I'd probably never see most of that money. But at least the truth was finally on record. I thanked her, paid her final invoice, and drove home to my one-bedroom apartment, where I'd been living like a broke college student for 9 years while funding someone else's lie. That night, I sat on my couch and thought about Leo. About whether I should pursue visitation. About whether it would hurt him more or help him to have me in his life after everything that had happened. I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't destroy my son's life. I stopped letting a lie fund itself. And if that makes me a monster in some people's eyes, I can live with that. Leo is in therapy now. Mark is trying to figure out how to be a father to a 9-year-old he didn't know existed. And Sarah is living with her parents while she deals with probation and bankruptcy. I loved a child who wasn't mine by blood. I showed up for him when I thought he was mine. I did everything a father is supposed to do. What broke everything wasn't the DNA. It was the moment she demanded more money and thought the truth wouldn't matter. This case really makes you think about how one lie can just unravel everything. Do you think I handled this the right way?